Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. So this is going to be Cities Rising, Rebuilding, Retooling, and Relearning. I'm very excited for this panel. As he mentioned, my name is Mitch Herckis, Senior Director of Programs at Route 50. If you haven't heard of us, Route50, we are part of Atlantic Media. We're one of their newest children in the Atlantic Media family. And we are focused on public sector leaders and how they are tackling issues of innovation, how they are tackling best practices, how they're sharing these things and learning from each other, particularly in the area of technology. So this is really up our alley these days. And for me personally, as someone who has worked in the nexus of Homeland Security, public safety, and telecommunications, I'm really excited to have this group with me to share these issues. So without further ado, let me start bring them up to the stage. First, I'm going to introduce Ellory, who is the co-founder and chief value officer of the Atlas. The Atlas is working with 70+ cities, both domestically and around the world, on issues around resiliency and technology and smart cities. After that, we have Sarah Hunter. She's the director of public policy at X. You might have remembered it as Google X, part of the Alphabet family. We also have Adam Lubinsky, who's a managing principal at WXY, which is an architecture firm that works on large urban planning issues, both here in New York and beyond. And finally, but last but not least, Alvaro Maldonado, who's the Secretary of Productive Development and Competitiveness for the city of Quito, Ecuador, who definitely gets, well, I believe, the longest flight here of the crew. So let's sit down and we can kind of start going through this discussion together. Hopefully this will be an informal conversation where we'll get to explore a lot of these issues around when cities rebuild, how they do so in a way that's intelligent and looking towards the future. That's not always an easy conversation, obviously, because we were talking a bit right before this about there's a goal to get things back to normal as soon as possible. But I kind of want to start a little farther back and ask each of you how you come in at this. What's the lens that you all are coming at this from to give our audience an idea of your background, where you come from. So let's start closest to me, since you got introduced last. Alvaro, how do you, in your role, come at this lens of technology, resilience, and recovery?
Well, thank you very much for inviting us. And yes, I would like to start by saying, telling you a little bit more about the city of Quito, capital of Ecuador, which is a very vulnerable city as well. We are at 9,200 feet above the sea level. It's a very high city, and we have very close to our city the highest active volcano in the world. We do have earthquakes, and actually we had an experience a couple of years ago with a major earthquake, 7.8 in the coast side of Ecuador. And actually, yes, in developing countries, major cities, they always respond to these events that are around the country in a very vulnerable area, a rural area. So yes, we had an experience of not only logistics for donations, but also of technology, using software and being fast, For resilience, what you need is really to have a fast response. So yes, I think the city is growing always. We as a capital city, in a developing country, we receive a lot of migrants as well, a lot of people who are getting into the city, and we need to bring and provide of more and good services, and that's part of the challenge. So maybe that's the reason we always have to be prepared in this case for resilience.
Yeah, and migration is also an interesting thing that people don't often think about as much with resilience as a key issue there. Adam, you've done a lot of work in New York City, particularly after Hurricane Sandy, but also around the country on resilience. How does that impact your lens that you come at this issue?
Well, it's interesting. WXY Studio really began to be most involved with the issue of resiliency right here on this spot. We began to do a plan to create access to the East River waterfront on the Manhattan side a couple of months before Superstorm Irene hit in 2011. And that work really looked to integrate physical access to the waterfront, and resiliency issues, even before Hurricane Sandy had occurred. And for us, looking at resiliency is really about looking at things through the lens of the public realm, ensuring that resiliency isn't just about creating a physical barrier, but is integrating social needs, economic needs, mobility needs at the same time. And I think as we work on public realm projects throughout the city, elsewhere, really wrapping together this idea of resiliency where it's not just about disaster prevention and preparedness, but it's really about livability in a way that hits a number of different buttons.
Yeah. And Sarah, you probably have the most forward-looking job, I would say, out of all of us here. You know, how does what you're doing day to day when you're looking at technology impact how you think about things of resiliency, recovery, and rebuilding?
Yeah, we come at this from a slightly odd perspective in that I work at X, which is a sister company to Google, and we're working on technology to solve big problems. So looking sort of 5 to 10 years ahead at new technologies that we could bring into communities to really make a big difference. So self-driving cars, drones, you know, those are some of the projects that we've been working on. But the conversation of resiliency, actually, one of our biggest projects is Project Loon, which is bringing internet via stratospheric balloons to rural places. It sounds crazy, hence the name Project Loon. But for us, we came to sort of city emergency response via Project Loon after the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. We scrambled to basically provide some emergency connectivity to the island for a number of months, working with the governor, working with AT&T and local people really to say, in a situation where there's no connectivity at all, how can something that actually is not really ready for full-scale deployment yet, how can it provide some sort of emergency support? So we, you know, as I said, we're looking long term, but actually in this scenario, we provided something in the very, very short term and learned a lot, I think, about what countries need, what locations need in times of real desperation.
Now, Ellory, I know you're working with a ton of cities across the US through the Atlas around this issue. You know, how are leaders starting to talk to each other when it comes to these issues? And what are the conversations they're having when it comes to sharing best practices or their experiences about how to build back smarter? And are they reaching out before the disasters? Are they scrambling afterwards? Is it a mix?
So that's the goal, is that they start reaching out to each other before the disaster strikes. You know, that's inherently what resilience is, right? Is preparing before the disaster so that you can bounce back quicker. I think more and more that's starting to happen, and we're seeing that with our 75 partner cities. You know, we're working with a handful of cities who have actually experienced disasters in the last couple years, unfortunately. And one of the best things that we've seen is actually the best practice sharing, the collaboration amongst governments that have recently experienced disasters. So sharing what's working, what's not working, you know, all of those kinds of things.
So I want to ask both Adam and Alvaro, are you all noticing a shift in how your city in particular, maybe New York City and some of the other cities you've worked with, are thinking about disasters in advance over the last few years? Have you noticed any sort of shift, and what would you attribute it to, if you might, from internal or working with cities?
Well, yes, actually, we really need to work very together to our sister cities. Of course, we need to have all these testimonials and best practices to put into practice also in a city like Quito. Yes, definitely, we hosted Habitat 3, the UN Urban Planning Conference, which is held every 25 years in Quito a couple years ago. And we had the opportunity of having all these experts from all around the world, and that was a major issue, you know, for the city. Actually, after this event, we were selected as one of the 100 resilient cities of the Rockefeller Foundation. And today we have a document, actually we have a book, you know, about Quito resilience, and it covers all. You know, it covers about logistics, economic, disasters, you know, and infrastructure, and that's in a way prepare us, you know, for a major issue in the near future.
What made you all decide, okay, we need to get religion on this, we need to kind of build a book, literally, about disasters?
I mean, citizens need to be aware, they need to understand, they need to be, to feel part of it. They of course, we've talked, and we have permanent training in schools, and also in a way to handle tough situations for the city. But definitely, as I said before, you know, in developing countries, capital cities also, they receive a lot of migrants, a lot of people. In Latin America, we have this, a lot of people coming from Venezuela, actually, and also from our provinces around, you know, from the urban areas. So the city is growing sometimes in disorder. We really need to have urban planning. And Quito actually is right in the highlands, you know, in the mountains. It's not that the city just grows around the city. You know, we have tunnels, bridges. You know, it's a tough city to build and to live in. But definitely quality of life is pretty good. It's a very green city, and of course people is pretty well prepared comparing, you know, to other cities in the region.
And Adam, could you talk a little bit, going back to that other piece about, have you seen a shift in how cities are thinking about disasters now, or resiliency in particular, over the last, say, decade?
So shortly after Hurricane Sandy, we worked on one of the projects in the Rebuild by Design competition. And our vision for that was really a very holistic vision for creating offshore barrier islands that really would have addressed on a very holistic basis the storm surges. It would have been very complicated to build. It was a great rhetorical discussion, and it sparked a lot of engagement between scientists and politicians. What we found instead is that there are a number of projects underway, but they move in fits and starts. They don't all stitch together to create a system, but when they do begin to develop, they're done on a fairly local basis. So they do start to integrate a lot of the challenges that I mentioned before, which is not just resiliency for storm surge issues, but also on the social side, on the economic side, and on the transportation side. We spent 3 years working on the Rockaway Boardwalk's reconstruction, and the boardwalk and the Rockaways was completely wiped away. And at the end of the day, there was an incredible process to create man-made dunes in front of the boardwalk, to lift the boardwalk up, and to create a new boardwalk, which was far more resilient, but also had a 5.5-mile continuous bike lane on it that is really the social center for the Rockaways and really supports a local economy in the summertime. So when these projects do begin to come together, they're not necessarily addressing all of the city's problems at once. But I was really encouraged, and I think a lot of people were really encouraged to see a project that really addressed multiple issues at the same time.
And Ellory, I kind of want to ask, because you work with so many cities, are you seeing more like I get that around building multi-use resiliency plus public spaces in various cities? Are they going there immediately? Because that's a relatively new phenomenon, is the sense I get.
So I don't know if they're going there immediately, but more and more that's what's happening. We tend to refer to that as integrated infrastructure. And a great example is from the city of Hoboken after Hurricane Sandy. They've started building a series of resiliency parks, what they're calling resiliency parks. And one of them, the Northwest Resiliency Park, it's basically it's a layer cake design. The very bottom of it is designed to hold tremendous stormwater, a huge volume of stormwater. Above that is actually an underground parking garage, which in the city of Hoboken is a huge, huge deal, right? Parking is a perennial issue in Hoboken. And then on the very top, they've left the entire top area open for green space, for open space. And again, that's a huge issue in the city of Hoboken. It's only a mile wide, doesn't have a ton of green space. I think a lot of times when folks are coming to an integrated infrastructure project, a resilience project that serves a lot of benefits and solves a lot of pain points for citizens. A lot of times that's happening first because of citizen pain points, but also because it can open up new funding and financing mechanisms for projects. You can access new types of federal grants. You can potentially subsidize a project with revenue. You can do all kinds of things when projects are designed in a way to solve a whole bunch of problems for citizens.
And I kind of wanted to bring in Sarah on this because I think one of the problems with that is we have, first off, institutions. I used to work with the Corps of Engineers a lot. They're not someone who often says, how do we make this more of a livable space? It's how do we put concrete here to stop this bad thing from happening? And I think there's some expectations around government about how things are done in the past, and therefore that works. X is on the other side of that equation. And one of the things when we were talking earlier that I mentioned was I had the privilege of hearing the Chief Information Officer for Puerto Rico speak recently at the National Association of State CIOs conference a month ago. And he mentioned that I kind of sensed some frustration that it took 6 days for the FAA to authorize Project Loon, which I thought, wow, 6 days, that's nothing. That's Herculean effort. But I think there's some expectations that things can be done quickly in government that sometimes, may take 6 days where you hope it takes 6 hours. Could you talk a bit about why that takes 6 days, or even, how it could be done quicker in the future to test new technologies that may be valuable during disasters?
I'm with you that 6 days to get the FAA to pick up the phone is miraculous, and so I was delighted. But I think you're right. I think there is a hope and a very well-grounded one that in a disaster situation where every hour matters, everyone else who's working on a project sees that and scrambles really fast to do things even quicker. Yeah. For us, it was actually, it took us, prior to working in Puerto Rico, we were doing a lot of testing in Peru, and when the floods happened there, we and our partner Telefonica turned on our service for the first time, and we managed to do that within a few weeks. And so to get it down to a few days in Puerto Rico was for us a huge step forward. But yeah, there's learning on both sides. I think it goes back to what Ellory was saying about having a plan beforehand. It's deeply ironic that what we offer is connectivity because, of course, when a disaster happens, the first thing you want to be able to do is pick up the phone, and you can't. There's nothing you can do to reach out to people to say, help us. So actually having a plan beforehand and knowing who's going to be doing what and what the expectations are about how quickly you can deliver that is super important because there's no point waiting till it happens.
But one thing, can I just add quickly?
Please.
One thing, so it's absolutely important to have a plan. But I will say that in the case of some disasters, there are examples where because of the crisis, there have been huge leaps forward.
True.
So for example, in the wake of Hurricane Harvey in Houston, they had this incredible groundswell of civic hacking and tremendous crowdsourcing for rescue efforts. Right. And now they're starting, now the question is how can they leverage that?
Right. And actually that was exactly true for us as well. We'd been testing Loon for many years, and it was only in a disaster where we realized, oh my God, we can do this so quickly. Yep. People will step up and help and find solutions for things that we, in our sort of Silicon Valley lab, had never imagined possible. The creativity that you generate on the ground when you have to do things is extraordinary. And actually, it's almost harder when you're outside of those circumstances to recreate that sort of energy.
And building on what Ellory said about Houston, I know that Code for America is now looking at how do they replicate and scale that so other countries can use similar technology around the country. Yeah. And I actually think it's interesting, you mentioned to me that in Quito, well, in greater, 2 years ago, there was a major earthquake along the coast, but folks in Quito were involved in a similar kind of communal hacking effort to build an app or a portal to have a similar sort of response. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we work very together with the private sector, and a lot of software companies from Quito actually developed this really, really fast because, when we had this kind of emergency, the first 24 hours are crucial. And yes, the response was immediate, and yes, we had this app, and in that way we had information on where the rescues need to be done, and where to deliver, all the goods and the donations from Quito to the coast side, to these small towns. Actually, yeah, these rural areas, these small cities, secondary cities in Latin America, they are very, very vulnerable also on their leadership. So I remember after the earthquake, the mayor of city of Bahía de Caracas, a small city in the coast, calling our mayor, almost crying, just give us a hand, just help us, I don't know from where to start. And yes, the response was very fast. Actually, our firemen, they took a plane the next half an hour after the earthquake, and they rescued 100 people. That if they have waited for other 24 hours, the results wouldn't be the same. So yes, you need to be fast. You need the use of technology is very, very important. Also important to mention here in Ecuador, actually, yes, everyone has a cell phone, but just very few have access to internet. Smartphones are only on 60% of the population. The rest, we have had installed in the city 400 hotspots of Wi-Fi. But yes, at the end, you need to reach the people also in a different way. Of course, this is changing little by little, but today you need to be very aware of the importance of training in schools and to be preventive, in advance. But yes, technology is a major issue that will help in the very, very short term and the first response to these major incidents.
A common thread I'm hearing here is kind of underneath is around expectations of citizens as well. And I think technology, or maybe the immediacy, we're used to being able to pick up our cell phone, and I suppose at some point, they probably said people are used to being able to turn on their taps. Like now we take a lot of things for granted, and we're starting to take the immediacy of things for granted. Could you talk a bit of how you're seeing it, citizen expectations in your work on the larger kind of urban planning scale, and kind of incorporating those? Because I think, particularly in the technology field, we often kind of have an idea of what's next and what's best, and sometimes the people who actually live in that environment have different ideas. So I thought you might be able to add something to that.
Sure. Well, we were talking before coming on stage about the fascinating topic of parking. And the challenges of making changes to the built environment when there's not a disaster there to spur it on. And parking is something that everybody hates and loves at the same time. And so, when it comes to expectations, a lot of the built environment is rooted in regulations and policies which are incredibly hard to move. And so we can be as visionary as we want on a kind of architectural level, but to start to set out new approaches is very complicated when you've got a range of embedded rules that require you to keep producing spaces for cars in the same kind of way, even though we have a whole range of shared mobility and car share and autonomous vehicles on their way. And so the complexity of being visionary and imagining something that's going to happen in 30 years and people who want to see these changes at the same time, very difficult to make that happen.
Yeah, and Sarah, you might have some advice on this. How do leaders and cities kind of think about building for the future in a way that's flexible? Because we kind of see a race right now going on. Everyone wants to put antennas on everything for 5G. They want to kind of get the best Internet of Things equipment on the ground in their cities and build for the next thing. But what if it's the beta instead of the VCR, or whatever the case may be? How do cities build in a flexible manner to adapt to new technologies?
Well, I think you probably have more experience on this than I do. I mean, I used to get asked this question a lot. I worked on the self-driving car project, Waymo, for many years, and the question I got asked most was, I make a 30-year planning decision. What should I be doing? How do I, particularly in cities where they're also seeing ride sharing and bikes and all these new experiments, frankly, around transportation. What does someone who has a long-term responsibility decide to do? And I'm afraid there are no easy answers right now. The thing that I say to cities generally is, don't make decisions now that you can't undo in a year or two. Because actually, what I do know about technology is that the costs and the size are being reduced so quickly that you're going to be buying a solution that frankly looks very expensive and difficult to undo right now. So I don't know if it's a very popular thing to say amongst sort of IoT providers, but I think being cautious about investing a lot of money in that sort of digital infrastructure is probably the best thing to do right now.
Well, you know, going back to this conversation, because it had an impact on me clearly with the Puerto Rico's chief information officer, he said the worst part was when people began to offer help, because he couldn't tell who was genuinely trying to give him something and who was trying to make a buck. So I think a good question would be, how do you suggest working with and around government when you believe you can help post-disaster? And I'll start with Ellory, since you hear from some cities often, and then maybe we can kind of open it up.
So I think it's important to remember post-disaster, back to your earlier question about citizen expectations. I think it's really important to remember that in the immediate wake of a disaster, you're talking about making sure water is clean, lights are on, roads are navigable, schools are open. And really, until all of those things are done, until everybody is back in their homes and until businesses are open again, you know, that's going to be the main priority, as it should be. That's going to be the main priority of a mayor, of a governor, of the federal government, quite frankly. And after that happens, that's when there's a golden opportunity, typically, to have a conversation about, okay, now that we're starting long-term rebuilding efforts, how can we rebuild in a way that's smarter, more sustainable, more resilient? And that's when a lot of the progress is being made, and that's when it's time to engage. But I think oftentimes, you know, there's this rush to criticism about why the crisis happened, why the disaster happened in the first place. And it's, you know, it's not productive. You have to wait until everybody, like I said, businesses are open, schools are open, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Alvaro, Adam, do you have anything to add on that front?
I think also logistics plays a major role in the post-disaster. You know, food security is also a major issue. In our case, I'll have to say, you might know some of the products Ecuador exports are basically from agriculture, but these are from the coast side, you know, bananas, cocoa, tropical fruits. That doesn't happen at 9,200 feet above the sea level. So our city is more industrial, and the productive areas are more like on the coast side. So we need to be very creative. And in that sense, as Resilience, we have a project about food security with urban agriculture, and this happens, you know, in the roof of the buildings, and this happens, and it's we've received recognitions abroad, and of course this is something that we want to reply also in other cities that have the same problem. But yes. After a disaster, food, logistics, and how to get there, you know, airports needs to be always the safest place. You know, the airport can't you know, it has to work well till the end. So all those things, you know, you're never completely prepared for a disaster. You know, this always catch us in surprise. But you need to be you need to have the population always aware, because this could happen anytime, and of course global warming is there, and it's happening.
And do you have stuff to add there, or maybe on kind of how we move toward, how do we convince people after a disaster? You know, there is the kind of immediacy of it, but also how do we say, okay, like when you're doing this next thing, when we get past we're back to okay, how do we move to the phase of why don't we think about this differently? How do those conversations go from your standpoint?
And I think there are different layers of engagement. There's engagement with communities, and communities can be quite nervous and concerned about change. there's engagement with government and how to begin exploring new options in terms of regulations. And then there's the design fields, which is how do they begin to insert themselves in ways that's helpful and not overly aggressive. And I think for our office, being in the design field or in the technology field, that's those are interesting moments, which is there's a chance to bring new ideas, and what's the appropriate way to do that? There's concern about sort of making a buck, and so like what's the right way to approach a problem where there's going to be a shared nexus there, that from the private sector perspective, it's a good idea, it can work, it's viable, it also works for the public sector and hits their needs, and then from the user perspective or the citizen on the ground, it's going to meet their needs. So I look at it, a lot of it in a self-critical way, which is like, what's the right way and the right moment for us to enter into the conversation?
And and I'll stick with you for a second on this, and then I want to open this up to the group. Are there equity conversations or other ethical considerations that you are thinking of when you have those conversations about restructuring and resiliency?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, first off, looking at sort of the ongoing sustainability and maintenance of spaces and how that's done, and in New York City particularly, a lot of that has shifted to private conservancies and other organizations, and that can work very well in Midtown Manhattan, but it may not work as well in other places. So how do you set up structures that's going to work in all different areas? And if it's not going to work in certain areas, how do you provide alternative supports for that? So this, the equity side is huge, and most of the places that get hit really hard in terms of storm surge are on the edges, and they're more likely to be in need of support.
Yeah, and are you all also having conversations around equity ethics when it comes to whether it be new technologies or resilience post-disaster with these cities? I open it to either of you to kick it off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yes, of course. And I think, particularly right now, I think Silicon Valley is very mindful of the secondary consequences, the unforeseen implications of technology that, people have invented through truly good motivation having, as I said, secondary implications that are not good. So even at our very early stage, we do try and think through, how could this be used in a negative way or in a way that actually makes cities less resilient? I mean, I think the conversation earlier with the mayor of Atlanta is a great example. We're all very big on bringing digital tools to help cities do better, but then when you have a cybersecurity attack, everything goes down and there's no backup system. So that's a great example of those sort of unforeseen consequences that even the most well-motivated people need to think through. I don't think there's an easy answer for this, I'm afraid. I don't think there's any perfect model for trying to sort of put in place guidelines, if you like, or ways to prevent that sort of stuff happening. But I do think being mindful of it and being aware of it is the first important step.
Yeah, one thing I'll add, I mean, when a disaster hits, it's disadvantaged communities that are hit hardest. There's tons of data and research that supports that. And I think this is what we were talking about earlier with regards to having a plan before something happens really comes in. So when you're talking about the importance of resiliency planning efforts and resilience strategies, I think this is really a really important issue. Equity concerns, inclusiveness, all of those kinds of things. And I think it's motivated some really significant progress. Things like cooling shelters for elderly populations. Those sorts of things. I mean, things that you don't realize until you look at what actually happens on the ground during disaster and take a step back and say, okay, if we took certain mitigating actions and we had a plan in place to deal with those vulnerable populations during disaster, we could probably avoid some of the worst impacts. And you're definitely starting to see that, especially in coastal Florida. That's definitely true.
You know, I'll add to this that I know California's done some really interesting things around equity and pre-planning and thinking about equity in their pre-planning. For instance, I know their emergency management office has looked at disabilities and kind of pre-positioning things like certain types of shelters and certain types of handicap-accessible showers in certain areas, knowing what populations with certain differently abled people are.
Absolutely.
They're also actually doing some interesting things around energy, and I want to touch on that a little bit. I know that very recently it looks like, well, I think it looks like they're going to pass something that requires, as of 2020, for solar systems to be installed on roofs of houses starting across California. That could also be an equity conversation because the cost of housing will go up in California, which is not already a very cheap place to live. But you know, is there room for regulation when it comes to building technologies and kind of saying we need to build back stronger and more resilient? And what kind of equations do people need to be considering? And we'll start on your end. As a government official, I know that bringing up regulation is always fun.
Well, yes, and actually energy is a major topic, and of course, we need to take advantage on that. We're right in the middle of the world. Quito, Ecuador is right in the middle of the world, so we don't have like the seasons, which is always sunny. So we need to take advantage on that, and yes, definitely we need to look for alternative for solar ecologic systems, and of course these are expensive. These are expensive. The first investment, you know, but afterwards, you know, in the long term, for sure this will be, and there are major projects also in the city. But you know, a little bit more like as a conclusion, I think yes, we need to work together with other cities. We need to have a good experience to get the best practices from other cities. But you need to design your own plan. No? Sometimes it's very tough or almost impossible to implement, you know, Singapore's strategy in Quito. So, you know, only the infrastructure, the culture, you know, the level of education, you know, is just different. So the idea is yes, to have the inputs from sister cities, but yes, you always need to have a special department of planning your own resilience strategy. Conclusion.
And as anyone else want to weigh in on energy or innovation regulation broadly?
I'll just add that energy is a particularly interesting case because if it's done well, solar, microgrids, islanding, all those kinds of things can greatly, greatly improve the resilience of a system. If it's done badly, solar can actually decrease reliability in a system. So that's a particularly interesting case where it needs to be done very thoughtfully and in a well-planned, system-wide kind of way.
That might be a separate chat.
Yeah, that's probably a separate.
You know, we have about 1:50 left, so let's real quickly just kind of do a lightning round here. What technological changes do you all believe are going to have the greatest impact on resiliency and recovery moving forward? What are you guys most excited about in this range? And we can just kind of go down the line. Who wants to be the first one? Who's the first victim here?
Okay, with you. Yeah, I mean, the world is globalized, you know, services and technology, you know, we all have access to it. And the major challenge is to adapt this technology to your reality. I think that's maybe like a conclusion. As I said before, you know, you need to create your own plan. But yes, I mean, technology is very close. You need to have also a very close relationship between the government, the universities, you know, the academia, and the private sector. That's major, very important.
So quickly, I would say electrification of vehicles. I think it's a low-hanging fruit. It requires the least amount of behavior change, and it can be, you know, battery-powered vehicles can have all sorts of other uses and benefits as well.
All right, Sarah.
I'd say buildings that can be brought up and brought down very quickly. So modular cities, that would be my invention of the future.
Very cool. Ellory.
I would say social networks. For me, all I had to do was look at how they were used after Hurricane Harvey in Houston, and I just think there's tremendous promise there.
Wow. Okay. Well, I would love to have more than 15 seconds to talk about all of those things. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Let's give a round of applause to this wonderful panel. Thank you guys for joining us. Appreciate it.